Welcome to our 5-minute Bible study. We're in the Acts of the Apostles. We're in chapter 13, and we're in the midst of the Apostle Paul's first missionary journey. Now, we saw in our last session that they began the journey in Cyprus, evangelizing that wonderful island. Had a great ministry there and established the church. After they had traveled over the island and established a church, they set sail again, this time going directly north, and landed in the province of Asia Minor, which is today Turkey. Let's begin the reading at verse 13. From Paphos, Paul and his companions, that of course is Barnabas and Mark, they sailed to Perga and Pamphylia, that's on the coast of Asia Minor, Turkey. There, John Mark left them to return to Jerusalem. From Perga, they went on to Pisidian Antioch. On the Sabbath, they entered the synagogue and they sat down. After there was the reading from the law and the prophets, the leaders of the synagogue sent word to them and said, "Brothers, if you have a word of exhortation for the people, please speak." We see them leaving Cyprus behind, going to Asia Minor. And there, Mark decides to leave the company. It says he returns to Jerusalem. Remember, the missionary group consisted of Paul, Barnabas, and the cousin of Barnabas, Mark. Why does he leave? Well, we don't really know. We can speculate. Maybe he was homesick and wanted to get back to Jerusalem. Maybe the rigors of the missionary journey were more than he had bargained for and he just got tired. Or it could have been that he's a little upset at the change in leadership. You know, when this missionary journey first began, it was Barnabas and Paul and Mark. Now it becomes Paul and Barnabas and Mark. Paul is obviously the leader. Now Barnabas recognizes this, and Barnabas, being the encourager he is, has no trouble with that change. Barnabas has no trouble playing second place. But perhaps Mark, his cousin, did have some difficulties. Maybe that's why he left. We don't know for sure. We just know that he left. Now, later on, this will be a point of contention, but that comes later in the story. So keep this in mind. We'll come back to it again later. So now it's just Barnabas and Paul. They've landed in Asia Minor. They go a little north inland to the city of Antioch, another city called Antioch. Remember, they had set out from the church in Antioch in Syria, and now they come to another city also called Antioch in Pisidia. It's a large city, and so there they decide to plant the church. On the Sabbath day, they go to the synagogue. Now, we've noticed already that this is always Paul's operating procedure. Whenever he goes to a new city, he starts in the synagogue. He starts with the Jewish community and those Gentile God-fearers who have connected themselves to the Jewish synagogue. Now, notice it says, after the reading from the law and the prophets, there's a particular order of worship in every synagogue. They're going to read from the law, that is the first 5 books of the Bible, what's called the Torah, or the books of Moses. There will be a reading from that, and then there'll be a reading from one of the prophets that kind of goes with the Torah. These are standardized readings. After they have the reading, someone will give a sermon to the congregation. Now, in Jewish synagogues at this time, you don't really have a preacher who speaks every week, but you do have a group of elders who oversee the synagogue, and they arrange each Sabbath for someone to speak, to give a word of instruction or a word of exhortation. Sometimes it's one of their own numbers. Sometimes it's a guest speaker. But they recognize that Paul and Barnabas are visiting among them. They do recognize these men are distinguished in some way. And so they ask them, "Would you like to speak?" And Paul takes the opportunity and is now ready to expound the gospel. So here we have the missionary party in Antioch on the Sabbath. Paul has been invited to speak, and he takes the opportunity to give the good news about Jesus. Now, from verse 16 onward, we have a lot of verses that are dedicated to Paul's sermon. He begins to talk about the history of Israel, how God had first delivered them from bondage in Egypt, brought them out a free people, how he had saved them. He talks about their history, the time of the judges, the time of Samuel. He talks about the first king, Saul. And then he talks about King David. He says David was a man after God's own heart. And then he says in verse 23, from this man's descendants, God has promised to bring to Israel a Savior, the Messiah. He said, I'm here to tell you about that Messiah, for he has come, Jesus. Jesus is the Son of David. Jesus is the Messiah. And so then he begins to talk about Jesus. He tells about John the Baptist and how he prepared the way. He tells about the kind of things that Jesus did to show who he was. And then he tells about how Jesus was crucified, how he was rejected in Jerusalem and placed on the cross. And then he tells the good news. God, he said, raised him from the dead. Our Jesus, the Messiah, he came for us. We crucified him. He died for us, but he rose again. And God demonstrated in the resurrection that Jesus is the Son of David, the Messiah, and the Son of God. And then Paul reaches the conclusion of his great sermon in verse 38. He says, my friends, I want you to know that through this Jesus, who was crucified for us, who was raised for us, through this Jesus, his forgiveness of sins is proclaimed to all people. Everyone who believes in Jesus is set free from their sin. You are justified, a justification you could not obtain under the law of Moses. All you have to do is believe. So in these verses, we have the clear presentation of the gospel, how it's the fulfillment of everything in the Old Testament. The Old Testament always pointed to the coming of the Messiah. He's come. He's Jesus. He died for us. He rose again. And all you have to do is believe. Verse 42 tells us, as Paul finished his sermon, the people said, come back next Sunday. Come back on the next Sabbath and speak to us again. And so when the congregation was dismissed, many of the Jews and the devout converts to Judaism, those are the God-fearers, they followed Paul and Barnabas and they talked with them, and they were urged to continue in the grace of God. It's a good beginning in this city of Antioch. As Paul has had the opportunity to present the gospel in the Jewish synagogue, many are excited, and he's been asked to come back the next Sabbath and say more. And so he prepares to do that. In our next session, we'll see what happens on the next Sabbath. But right now we see that the journey's going well, and he's got a good start in the city of Antioch. Many people have responded in a positive way to the preaching of the gospel of Jesus. Jesus, our Savior, who died for us and rose again. You have a great day today. I'll see you for our next session as we talk more about what happens on this journey in the city of Antioch. Have a great day.